Welcome back to our Ancient Persia video lectures, and we're going to continue to discuss and conclude our conversation about Xerxes' invasion of Greece in 480 to 479 BCE. Now, we all know that Xerxes captured Athens in the fall of 480, but just after this capture, the Persian fleet suffered a massive offshore defeat at the Battle of Salamis at the hands of a Spartan-led navy that was heavily made up of Athenian Greek triremes. After the defeat at the Battle of Salamis, Xerxes himself returned to Sardis, where he spent the winter of 480 to 79 and most of the year 479. He left behind a Persian land army in northern Greece, commanded by Mardonius, the son of Gaubaruva, who had been one of the key nobles of Darius's reign. Mardonius is depicted by Herodotus as a sort of evil advisor to the king, the devil on his shoulder, who is telling him, invade Greece, it's going to be easy, I'm going to be satrap, we're going to have a cakewalk. And ultimately, Mardonius seems to be treated as the scapegoat for all that goes wrong with the Persian invasion by land. He's left behind with the Persian forces. He fails in a diplomatic initiative to try to divide Athens from Sparta in the winter of 480 to 79. And after raiding Athens and burning it again in the spring of 479, he is locked into a stalemate with Greek forces and finally defeated in a land battle by the Greeks, the Battle of Plataea in the summer of 479. So trying to think about the losses of the Persians in Greece, we have a number of problems that we have to grapple with. First and foremost, why did the Persians lose the Battle of Salamis? And why did they lose the Battle of Plataea? These are the strategic and tactical questions. Should they have fought in the first place? Was defeat inevitable? Was it the result of inferiority in technology and military practice, or was it simple bad luck? The next bigger question to think about is why the Persians didn't try again. After the destruction of Mardonius and the retreat of surviving Persian forces from Greece in 479, why doesn't Xerxes ever come back? Why isn't there a subsequent Persian attempt? They had suffered a few early defeats in the Ionian Revolt. Later on, at the end of the 5th century, when Egypt revolts from Persia, they will then launch multiple 4th century campaigns until they take the country back. So why do they let Greece go and let it remain an imperial failure? Finally, what does this mean for the empire? How important are military defeats in Greece? What would these look like from the perspective of a Persian imperial worldview? In terms of tackling these questions, we're of course handicapped by the lack of Persian narrative sources or even documentary sources that connect directly to the campaign. However, Herodotus gives a detailed account that shows some familiarity with parts of the Achaemenid worldview. We also have our background knowledge of the Persian infrastructure, logistical, and military system. We can try to set these events in perspective while taking a critical look at Herodotus's narrative. Herodotus gives a detailed description, but of course is not a primary source, is still a secondary source, is subject to certain types of bias, which may distort some of his conclusions. So in terms of Salamis and Plataea, what went wrong? Why did the Persians fight and why did they lose? For the Battle of Salamis, Herodotus places a great deal of emphasis on Persian arrogance and hubris, the sort of Persian belief that they can't be stopped. Remember, he set up his entire histories as the story of how great powers are greedy and want more and keep reaching for more until they overreach and they fail. And for him, Xerxes' military failures in Greece are the ultimate illustration of this philosophy. So in some sense, Herodotus thinks that Persians are going to fail because they don't think they can lose, and ultimately they arrogantly go into this bad tactical situation, sending their fleet into narrow straits. They cancel out their advantage, and they allow the Greeks to fight with them with greater order and discipline, and to win. Herodotus also emphasizes the trickery of one of the Greek generals, an Athenian politician named Themistocles, who had helped to build and now to lead Athens' navy. Supposedly, Themistocles, this sort of trickery slippery character, engages in a trick by sending a message to Xerxes and offering to defect with the Athenian fleet, to turn on the other Greeks with whom Athens is quarreling, if the Persians will send ships into the Salamis Straits. Now, this idea of the trickster getting the advantage over the aggressor has a long history in Greek folklore traditions. In some ways, Themistocles is an Odysseus figure who is outwitting his arrogant opponents. However, there is good reason for the Persians to expect Greek division, Greeks turning on one another. This seems to have been a factor in the Battle of Lade in the Ionian Revolt, where Ionian contingents supposedly deserted the main rebel fleet as the Persians are moving in for the kill. There may have been the reason of precedent that could have convinced Persian commanders that the Greek fleet would not hold up, would not stick together if they attacked. Now, once they go into the straits, the Battle of Salamis involves ramming and boarding between many hundreds of triremes on both sides. The Persian fleet's larger numbers may indeed hamper it in the narrow waters of the Salamis Straits. That being said, Herodotus does not give a precise figure for the number of ships the Persians lost. A very late source, the historian Diodorus, who writes around 50 BCE, claims that the Persians lost 200 ships sunk and many more captured, whereas the Greeks lost only 40 sunk. This figure is sometimes adopted by modern scholars, but the disproportion seems hard to believe. The Greek crews are made up of volunteers who have not been spending their lifetime sailing and rowing triremes in the water. There's every reason to think that the Greeks would have taken significant losses while battering back and forth against Persian ships in the Salamis Straits. Now, when the Battle of Salamis is over, Xerxes' fleet is mauled but not destroyed. Herodotus tells us that he's able to send both Phoenician and Ionian Greek contingents back to the eastern Aegean. And then ultimately some of them spend the winter in Ionia, while others seem to go back to their eastern Mediterranean ports. Xerxes himself decides a few days after Salamis to return to Sardis and to winter there. The great question is whether this was an automatic result of the battle or whether Xerxes would have gone back to Sardis anyway. Remember that he is far from the center of his empire. Royal campaigns on a distant frontier can't last too long without perhaps endangering the center of the empire by encouraging revolt through the king's absence. Xerxes himself is overall going to devote about 3 years to the campaign, going from the center to Sardis, Sardis to Athens, Athens to Sardis, and then a long stay there before going back again. This is comparable in time to the amount of time that Darius had spent in his European campaign, residence at Sardis and return, from about 512 to about 510. So it's possible that Xerxes all along intended to oversee a spectacle of victory by taking Athens, maybe winning a victory over the Greek fleet, and then returning to Sardis while leaving troops behind to mop up the resistance. In any case, if he planned to go home anyway, going home after a large defeat and heavy casualties looks different than going home after simply burning a great enemy center. And Xerxes may have stayed at Sardis for an extended period of time in order to try to stay in close contact with his land army in Greece. On the one hand, continuing his plans for a return, but on the other hand, trying to assure his personal association with overseas success. Now, what went wrong at Plataea? Plataea is a very different sort of struggle. Herodotus describes it in great detail in Book 9, the final climactic book of the histories. There, it's been debated whether the Persians had such a large numerical advantage as Herodotus claims. They're certainly the largest coalition army of Greek hoplites between Athens and Sparta and their allies that was ever put in the field, that confronts the Persians in a 2-week standoff at Plataea and then engages in the actual battle. As Herodotus describes it, there are blunders committed on multiple occasions by both sides at Plataea. But Herodotus makes Mardonius the arrogant Persian scapegoat for what goes wrong in the campaign. He claims that as the Plataea stalemate drags on, supplies start to be interrupted for both sides, and a Persian general named Artabazus suggests that maybe we shouldn't be fighting a battle at all. Maybe we should retire to better supplied bases and use bribery to try to break up the Greek coalition. Mardonius supposedly responds that he prefers the old-fashioned Persian custom of battle man-to-man, and dismisses this wise advice and instead goes into a fight that we know he's going to lose. We don't know if this really happened, or if this is hindsight after the fact. Artabazus lived through the battle and then became a key Persian frontier administrator for several decades. And again, we may have defeat being associated with those who are conveniently dead, rather than administrators who continue to work for Xerxes for the next several years. Now, in the actual fighting at Plataea, the Persians used their cavalry to great advantage. Persian and allied Greek cavalry, opposed to the Athenians and Spartans, managed to intercept a wagon train of supplies coming to the Greek army. They managed to do great damage and deprive the Greeks of water by harassing them with arrow fire at the springs where they're trying to water their army. And as Herodotus depicts it, eventually towards the end of the Plataea standoff, the Greek army is running out of supplies, much of it is demoralized, and its Spartan general, Pausanias, orders a retreat. The retreat happens during the night and is badly managed, and the Greek army splits up into multiple groups with their backs to a significant mountain, Mount Kithaeron. So supposedly the next morning, Mardonius overreacts to the retreat and splitting up of the Greek army. He assumes that they're on the run, that they're in the process of breaking up and fleeing, and he orders what he thinks is a pursuit, when in fact portions of the Greek army have withdrawn to very defensible pieces of ground where they intend to make a stand. So ultimately, the Battle of Plataea is fought as several scattered, separate engagements across very hilly terrain in central Greece. One of these engagements pits the forces of Persia's Greek subject allies, Thebes, Thessaly, Macedonia, and others, against the Greek hoplite militia of Athens, and the Athenians win that encounter. The other engagement pits Persian infantry led by Mardonius against the Spartan infantry led by Pausanias. And in that climactic fight, a Spartan charge breaks through and smashes down the Persian lines. Mardonius is killed, and his key Persian troops rout. And that ends the Battle of Plataea. Surviving Persian forces then retreat out of mainland Greece. Why did the Spartans beat the Persian infantry in this hand-to-hand showdown? Herodotus claimed earlier, describing Thermopylae, that Spartan spears were longer than Persian ones, and that this gave them an advantage. At Plataea, he suggests that the Spartans are better equipped and armed in general, He says the Persians were brave, but were fighting as if they were naked men against armored hoplites. However, a number of revisionist scholars have tried to challenge parts of this claim. Certainly, there is not clear artistic or archaeological evidence that can support the claim that Greek spears were longer than Persian ones, and that this played a decisive role. Herodotus contradicts himself on Persian armor, suggesting Persian troops at Plataea are unarmored, but earlier referring on several occasions to Persian body armor, which seems similar to what Greek hoplites possessed. Persian infantry seem to have carried wicker shields at Plataea that may not have been as heavy as the oak Greek hoplite shields. But in general, it seems that it's wiser to look for other factors besides simple technology as an explanation for why the Persians are defeated and the Spartans won. The death of the Persian commander in battle, the fatigue of the Persian troops during this long pursuit over hilly terrain, not expecting a Greek counterattack, all of these may have played a role in a Persian defeat that was otherwise not inevitable. We also see the Persians have cavalry that seem to have worked effectively in covering the retreat and after the battle. And it's not clear why they didn't play a greater role during the actual fighting. This remains one of the mysteries of Plataea. In any case, after Plataea, Persian forces are swept out of mainland Greece. And the nature of the fighting changes. At the same time, a Greek fleet lands troops and defeats some Persian troops at Mycale in Ionia. Late in that year, the Greek forces begin attacking some of Xerxes' forts and logistical stockpiles in Thrace, in the areas where the army had staged its initial assemblies before moving into Macedonia and Greece proper. By 477, the Spartans are going to drop out of the fighting, but the Athenians are going to build their new Delian League and continue to attack Persian forces in northern Thrace, in the Aegean Islands, and in Ionia, gradually building up the Delian League as an Athenian-led Greek territory separate from Persian rule. So why don't the Persians come back and try it again? Logistically, this would have been very difficult after the Persian stockpiles are emptied and after the key bridgeheads and stockpile locations have all been captured in Greek attacks on Persian forts in Thrace in the 470s. Those sorts of early Athenian counterattacks played a key role in making it difficult to concentrate the same type of Persian forces on the frontier as the Persians had before the invasion. The Persians could have chosen to restage the invasion, but this would have involved multiple years of stockpiling and preparation before it was possible to build up an army on the same scale and go and do it again. There is also a different factor, an ideological factor at play. Xerxes goes back to the center of the empire. And we should remember, thinking about the earlier pattern of Persian royal campaigning, Cyrus, as far as we know, and Darius seem never to have repeated a personally led campaign in the same location. And this is significant. Earlier Assyrian and Babylonian rulers had led military expeditions repeatedly against the same enemy in the same area. But the Persian kings seem to refrain from doing this. As we saw with King Darius, he seems to have led one major campaign each, to each corner of the empire, to symbolize his rule of the world. I would suggest that a similar pattern may influence Xerxes' thinking. There may be continued fighting on the Greek frontier between the king's delegates, especially the satraps at Sardis and Dascylium in Hellespontine Phrygia, and the Greeks. But the king, if he tries to redo his campaign, would have to admit that the campaign itself had been in some sense a failure. Repetition suggests that the first time did not get it right. And if Xerxes' response to the campaign is to emphasize the mission accomplished moment of burning Athens, the king marched to the edge of the world across the sea and punished the strange foreign people at its edge, and then he returned to the center. If that's the propaganda approach, and then the localized defeats in Greece can be blamed on dead generals like Mardonius, then the king shouldn't need to go back and repeat this campaign. Now, we also are incredibly ill-informed about the remaining years of Xerxes' reign. We really don't know much of anything that Xerxes did from 479 to his assassination in a court conspiracy in 465. And it's important to remember that there's still the entire center and eastern half of the empire. We do have some images surviving on Persian seals from the later 5th century that show Persian warriors fighting against Saka nomads from the eastern frontiers. It's possible that Xerxes engaged in other military actions in the east, which our written sources leave completely unmentioned. What is clear is that the defeat in Greece, from the Persian perspective, has to be fit into a wider imperial vision. It's not clear that the Persian defeat in Greece was unimportant, but on the other hand, it's not clear that it would have outweighed Xerxes' victories in Egypt and Babylon from the perspective of the imperial center. Xerxes himself becomes something of a mystery to us. We know he engages in major building activities at Persepolis in the later parts of his reign. Our lack of knowledge on the later reign makes it hard for us to say whether he was judged in Persia in any great degree by the Greek defeat. In any case, what we are going to see in Persia's later relations with the Greeks is an evolution, an adaptation from straight military action, display of power through sending armies across the sea, to a more diplomatic approach. Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes I, his grandson, Darius II, and his great-grandson, Artaxerxes II, would all engage in displays of power and influence across the sea in Greece through diplomacy rather than military invasion. And in the long run, these would prove far more successful in extending Persian imperial influence over the northwestern frontier.